All right, so let's go to our last presentation by Philippe Crist. So Philippe Crist belongs to the International Transport Forum. So I guess if in the Tour de France jargon, we'll call him the regional guy today. So he will actually give us maybe an overview of various research being carried out by the ITF within the OECD, since Philippe is responsible for coordinating several international research initiatives amongst ITF members. Many projects focusing on big data, automated vehicles, sharing economy, improving cycling safety, and a lot of other things. So, Philippe, please tell us about that.
Thank you. Thank you, Marc. I think what you'll see in my presentation is that there's a bit of continuity, especially in the last three presentations. I'll present some of the insights that we've developed at the ITF on work that we've recently carried out, looking on how the convergence of shared vehicles and self-driving vehicles, what the impacts might be in the cities in a unnamed future. We don't put a time on it. But we do wanted to see what the range of impacts would be and what the scope of the impacts might potentially be. And before I start talking about that, I think there's a bit of context setting that's necessary, because we have to remind ourselves, why is it that we're looking at these technologies? Why are we looking at these changes in mobility patterns that could be possible? And in particular, this context setting has to do with both the urban and the human. Now, I don't have to tell you that cities are massively popular. More than 50% of the global population lives in these cities. More than 70% of wealth production takes place in cities, almost an equal share of greenhouse gas emissions. Cities concentrate both access and opportunity. But it's equally important to remember that 30% of the world's urban areas are comprised of low-income informal settlements, favelas, shantytowns, slums, and other marginal residential or commercial spaces. People crowd into cities because both for the rich and for the poor, cities are formidable economic accelerants. They build on the access to labor and jobs on the one hand, and also the access to creativity and ideas on the other. But cities are also spaces, and when you take away the space allocated to buildings, you're left with the latticework of space allocated to mobility and transport. Though these transport and mobility are important functions in our cities, they are not the only function of the space between the buildings. And the cities that we get when we focus only on how well that space moves vehicles around can be rather inhospitable places for humans. And this would be unfortunate, because the strength of our societies, the strength of our cities, rest upon the people that are at the heart of both. Before speaking about transport in the cities and towns of the 21st century and some of the transformative changes that we've heard about already, we need to talk first about the cities and the towns of the 21st century and of all the trips that we'll make there. 400 trillion trips. These are the number of trips that we expect the human species will make cumulatively going out to 2050, as we grow to 9 billion people. 54 trillion of these trips will be new trips, trips that we don't make today that are linked to population growth. 94% of these trips will take place in emerging economies, and almost every single new trip will take place in an urban setting. These trips will accompany population growth, and as we look to the recent past and to the near future, we see that not only will the 21st century be the urban century, it will also be the Asian, African, and Latin American century. Now, this population growth has been accompanied by a rapid increase in the built-up area of many countries. Here, for example, 10 years of urban growth in the Yellow River Delta around Shanghai in China between 2000 and 2010. This growth in China, but everywhere, will pose formidable challenges for urban governance and sustainability if we do not become more creative at better handling the access and mobility conundrum in our cities, in places like on the streets of Jakarta, like, unfortunately, this is my own experience, in the Paris metro, or even on the bicycle tracks of the Netherlands and Denmark. Thanks for the picture. So in our study, we decided to look at a potentially disruptive future urban transport pathway that could improve access in our cities. And that starts with this fact. Cars are massively underused capital assets. They're used less than 1 hour a day, 23 hours per day on average. They sit parked, taking up space in our driveways or in our cities. That we put up with such inefficiency reveals just how much we value the services that cars provide. But cars are not the only underused private good. Homes, Wi-Fi bandwidth, office space often also lie underused. And for all of these goods, the advent of network technologies has facilitated the sharing of unused capacity among individuals. Now, car and ride sharing is squarely at the heart of the shared economy, with dozens of operators, both legacy operators and new entrants, offering a wide range of services, including, I think I have Sweden in there as well. And tellingly, a few of these are very well capitalized automakers, rental companies, and innovators, and they offer some of the most popular services. But one thing that all of these services have in common is that they still require a driver behind the wheel. The arrival of highly automated and ultimately fully self-driving cars on our roads could radically change this state of affairs. Moreover, while many car manufacturers take and this is to quote a great song by the Talking Heads for those who remember them, a same as it ever was approach. That is, they expect that we will use highly automated vehicles much as we use cars today. That was not our starting point, and it is not our expectation. Our project was a what-if exercise that sought to understand what might happen if a mobility service based on a fleet of fully shared and fully self-driving vehicles replaced every single car trip and every single bus trip in a mid-sized European city. Now, it is not a transition scenario. We do not explain or explore how this might happen, but we undertook this study to delineate the range of potential outcomes and the scale of these outcomes. We started with a real city, with its street topology and traffic rules. It's a mid-sized European city. We used real data on origins and destinations and the timing of travel. And we used real routes to plot travel based on the shortest time and least detour, considering the rules of the road and the street topology. Now, we modeled two types of shared self-driving vehicle services. One are ride-sharing taxi bots. Unfortunately, that is a trademark name, not by us, so you might not be seeing this name much longer. These taxi bots pick up and drop off passengers along routes that are optimized in real time. Now, this mode implies simultaneous sharing of vehicles. Autobots, sounds a bit like something out of Star Wars, pick up passengers or parties one at a time and deliver them to their next destination before picking up another party or another passenger. This type of operation involves sequential sharing of vehicles. And in both cases, we modeled 3 different classes of vehicle sizes, up to 8 passengers. We accounted for the presence or not of high-capacity public transport. In our base case city, it was a metro system. It could have been another type of high-capacity system, like a bus rapid transit system. In our model, we allocated all those trips that were within a certain radius of the, in this case, metro station to that mode. We assumed that all trips taken by bus and all trips taken by car were taken by one of these 2 configurations of shared self-driving vehicles. And we assumed that trips, pedestrian trips, walking trips of less than 1 kilometer remained as walking trips. We didn't model the impacts on bicycle usage because this city, and if you need to know, it's Lisbon, does not have a great deal of cycling due to the topography in its center. Now, we looked at these impacts over the course of the day, so over 24 hours, and we also looked at the impacts at peak hours, because peak hours, rush hours, are the real constraining factor in how the system can operate. And crucially, we modeled all trips in the simulation so they were started with no more than a 5-minute delay on the base case trip, and that each trip's duration did not surpass by 20%, capped at 10 minutes, the base case trip, because we individually replicated each trip in the city, and that each trip's length did not surpass the original length by 20%, capped at additional 2 kilometers. And this is what we found. In the case of the ride-sharing taxi bot system, and in the presence of high-capacity public transport, a shared self-driving fleet would deliver the same mobility in our base case, but with only 10% of today's vehicles. That is, you could remove 9 out of 10 vehicles off the streets of this city with the same, almost the same service quality in terms of trip timing. Now, this is a significant effect, but one that is largely consistent with other studies that have been done in New York, in New Jersey, and Ann Arbor, also in Singapore. Now, as I said, the rush hour, peak hour trips are the real constraint. And here again, looking at the ride-sharing scenario with public transport, we could see that you could remove 2 out of every 3 vehicles operating at rush hours. Now, this is for the taxi-bot ride-sharing system. The sequentially shared Autovot system requires more vehicles to serve the same number of trips, but even at peak hours, Autovots could remove nearly half, 44% of all cars traveling today, assuming there is the high-capacity public transport. But even without the metro system, it could remove a quarter of the cars that are already on the streets today. Now, this will have significant repercussions on parking needs and the allocation of public space in the city. In all of the scenarios that we studied, we found that on-street parking could be completely removed, allowing the reallocation of 1.5 million square meters to other uses. Now, this space is equivalent to about 210 football pitches, twice the area of the Vatican. It is a significant amount of space. In fact, it accounts for 20% of the curb-to-curb street space in the city. Freeing up such a significant share of space in the city leads to new and previously unimaginable possibilities. Alternative uses could include expanding public space, like here, the parklets that we see in some cities in North America, but also in Europe, or freeing up space for active transport, for walking, for cycling, or freeing up space for deliveries and remunerated commercial use until, of course, we have these flying delivery vehicles that we might see. Most cities also devote a considerable amount of off-street space to parking. And we found in the ride-sharing plus public transport scenario that up to 80% of that parking would be superfluous and could be released for other uses. In the most favorable case, that would account for almost 1.2 million meters of space, 170 football pitches for those who are able to calculate that amount of space. This amount of space could be used for other services, for example, logistics distribution centers that could be serviced by self-driving delivery shuttles. Now, in terms of the volume of travel, in terms of the amount of kilometers traveled, it's clear that the type of mobility configurations that we modeled of shared and self-driving vehicles would travel more than today's cars. And this is because they are assumed to replace all bus travel, but especially because of the additional travel required for pickups and drop-offs and repositioning. With high-capacity public transport, distances traveled increased from 6% to 44%, depending on the type of taxi-bot versus Autovot scenario we're looking at. And at peak hours, travel would also increase by 8% to 54%, respectively, for the same scenarios. Now, these increases in travel may be manageable given the traffic flow efficiencies that we estimate could be realized by fully automatic cars. But in the absence of high-capacity public transport, all bets are off, because travel could nearly double. This would undoubtedly be extremely challenging to manage. Now, we also looked at where on the road network this increase in travel occurs. And we looked at it by different types of roadway classifications, motorways, trunk roads, distributors, and local roads. In terms of occupancy of the road's technical carrying capacity today, in the base case morning peak, we see that all but local roads operate at about 30 to 40% of their capacity. So this is the case today. In the taxi-bot plus high-capacity public transport scenario, much of that increase, you see increases on local roads, so a 31% increase. and in the Autovat without high-capacity public transport scenario, so this is the scenario where traffic increases the most, we see that traffic on local roads more than doubles. This means that the types of scenarios we modeled would lead to an increase in traffic in parts of the city where significant traffic was largely absent previously. This relative increase in traffic could certainly cause discomfort for those who are living there and lead to a rise in conflicts with pedestrians and with cyclists. Of course, there would likely be beneficial safety impacts, and the environmental impacts associated with increased travel could be managed by looking at different types of technology deployment, hybridized drivetrains, and ultimately electric drivetrains. On that last point, we did model an electric vehicle fleet in these different configurations with fast recharging times and more range, but still having to come offline in order to recharge, and when their range limits were met. And what we found is that from the scenarios that we modeled, you would see only a 2% more increase in travel. So these system efficiency, these impacts of having electric vehicles would not be significant. So what are the key policy takeaways from this exercise? The first is that proactive policies will be needed to ensure that the management and reallocation of newly freed up space is both efficient and purposeful. Without foresight and guidance, especially guidance where necessary, there's a risk that potential benefits will be eroded and lost. That a shared and self-driving fleet gives rise to increased travel is not in and of itself problematic, in all but the most extreme scenarios, as I pointed out. There are many technical ways in which this increase can be managed, and the ways in which the negative impacts from increased travel can be reduced. But the relative increases on certain parts of the network and in certain parts of the city will be more challenging to manage. And this is because the increase in traffic could change the nature of certain residential streets and render travel by active modes less pleasant and therefore less attractive. We scanned existing and planned legislation relating to automated vehicles. And here, of course, regulatory action is underway. But our scan revealed that all initiatives that we found focus on testing, licensing, and operations of vehicles on public roads. To our knowledge, no jurisdiction has taken anticipatory action to change the regulatory framework surrounding some of the likely use cases for fully automated vehicles, like, for example, in providing long-distance road haulage, or shared taxi-like and quasi-public transport-like services. One of the interesting things that we found in this study is that only about 5,000 extra self-driving vehicles could replace every single trip taken, in this case, on the metro system that we were looking at. These extra vehicles would completely obviate the need for a high-capacity public transport system in this mid-sized city. And this would represent significant cost savings. The deployment of self-driving and shared fleets in an urban context will directly compete with the way in which taxi and public transport services are currently organized. There will be labor issues. We already see that happening now. They will be significant, but there is no reason why public transport operators or taxi companies could not take an active role in providing the types of services that we've developed here. It is clear, though, that the governance of transport services, including concession rules and arrangements, will have to adapt. The drastic reduction in the number of cars would significantly impact car manufacturer business models. New service-based business models will develop under these conditions, but it is unclear who will manage these and how they'll be monetized. Under all of our scenarios, vehicles are used much more intensely than before, rising from approximately 50 minutes per day to about 12 hours per day, and rising from about 30 kilometers per day to nearly 200 kilometers per day per vehicle. This increase in use will require different car models that are currently on the market today, but will also induce a shorter turnover time for the fleet, which can help the penetration of potentially cleaner technologies. And finally, of course, I don't mean this literally, but when we undertook this exercise, it required the parsing, calculating, analyzing of a huge amount of data. And in real life, such a system will be both massively data intensive, just as it would produce a prodigious amount of usable data. Mobility as a service cannot exist without near real-time access to a wealth of high velocity and highly personal location data. This data is a source of innovation, but it is also a source of worry, especially as concerns privacy. Our feeling is that location data privacy is an area where sufficient guarantees on trust are not yet in place and where regulation has yet to ensure an adequate balance between private and public interests. So there, in a nutshell, are some of the big takeaways from this study, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philippe. Yes, indeed. I mean, it seems that what you just showed is kind of redefining the sheer notion of public transport, indeed. That's quite a mind-blowing way of looking at these new settings.